Welcome to Drug-Free Workplaces in an Increasingly Tolerant and Stoned Society. I'm Mike Coffey, President of Impaired Information Group. This is one of the presentations that we include in our series to help employers fairly and legally make well-informed hiring decisions about the people they involve in their business. I am an HR guy who 23 years ago now had a HR consulting practice that turned into a background screening company for to serve the needs of one client. And here we are 23 years later, and I have an amazing team that does background checks and other kind of due diligence, as well as facilitate drug screens and other projects for clients all over the country. It's always important to me to put in a plug-in for second chance employment. Everybody thinks that because, well, you're a background screening company, you're out there trying to keep people from getting jobs, and that's simply not the case. There's a job for everyone out there, but not everyone's right for every job. And sometimes the risks associated with putting the wrong person in a specific role don't make sense from an employer's point of view, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't consider that employer or that candidate for another position. And this is the whole series of webinars that's available on our website at imperativeinfo.com. Covers a lot of the entire process that when I'm doing my consulting with clients, we sit down and go through all the considerations so that before anyone ever encounters a candidate, primarily we're talking about criminal history, they already know what the risk is associated with that, putting that particular person with that history in that role. But they also have clear guidelines to help them consistently and hopefully with less bias consider each candidate on a case-by-case basis. So I always want to throw that out there because, and that whole series starts off with the business case for becoming a second chance employer. In fact, I'm delivering a conference presentation here in a couple of weeks for the North Texas SHRM chapter at their annual conference on that very topic. So all that to say, that's what we do. That's who I am. And kind of that's what our belief is. But today we're here to talk about the prevalence of drug use in our society and what that means for employers and how employers can compliantly and certainly legally and from a business case practically protect themselves from some of the side effects, the knock-on effects that come from from drug use. I will also say that many of you are watching this webinar live, and you'll get an email probably tomorrow from my team after the webinar is completed tomorrow sometime, and it'll share the HRCI and SHRM recertification information. This is a pre-approved for an hour of recertification information of credit. But if you're watching this recording, you're going to be watching it at imperativeinfo.com. And at the end of the webinar, I will share the keyword you need to fill out the form below the video and get your credit completed, get your HRCI and SHRM credit. So let's get on with it. So let's talk about drug use in the US. These are the latest numbers available from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's their 2020 National Survey on Drug Use, and most of the data we published in 2020. Most of the data is really, it was collected in 2019. I think some of the numbers may be different as they roll forward. No, actually, I'm sorry. This is 2020 data, so it was published early 2021. So this is 2020 data. I still think that we'll see numbers increase as we move forward in and get 2021 data released later this year, early next year. But you can see that about 20% of adults over the age of 26 used illicit drugs at some point within the last year. And in that age range of 18 to 25, 37% have used drugs, illicit drugs, illegal drugs at some point in the last year. Nationally, of all individuals over age 12, the actual drug use number was between those two. It was 21.4% across the entire population in the US over the age of 12. So, that's a pretty significant number. What are the drugs of choice? Well, obviously, it should be probably a surprise to no one that marijuana is the number one drug of choice. Now, what's interesting is it's down a little bit for 2020. In 2019, it hit an all-time high of 35.4%. And so 34.5% is about a point lower for those from the 18 to 25-year-old cohort. And, it's at about 16% for the 26 plus age group. Now, what's interesting is that 26 point age group is that's an all-time high for them. That's up a point from 2019. So older folks are smoking more weed, and younger folks are smoking less, maybe, or it could have just been the sample issues. But also, what we're seeing is, I think the fact that those people that were 18 to 25 and were more comfortable admitting that they smoked marijuana and other kinds of THC edibles and things like that, they're aging out of that 18 to 25 group. They're a bigger part of our adult, or whatever you want to call it, our 26-year-old and older group of adults. And so I think you're going to see more and more of that number. And you see across the bottom here, all the other drugs, but they really pale in comparison to use marijuana. So what I did is create a slide, and I slipped marijuana out so we can zoom in a little better to see what the drugs, other drugs of choice are. And so what's really interesting here, looking at their data, is that the use of hallucinogens, you got to say that 5 times to get it right, has doubled in adults over age of 26 since 2017. This includes LSD, PCP, psilocybin, which, mushrooms, and ecstasy. And actually, ecstasy is the one that really drives that. But number 2, a pretty close second, I think, was PCP, which was a surprise to me. But we are seeing increases in psilocybin and mushrooms as mushrooms or psilocybin gets more use and more consideration for therapeutic use. Other people, I think, are using it more recreationally. We don't see psilocybin testing positive in drug tests nearly as much, or hallucinogens in general, because quite honestly, if somebody is under their influence, they're probably not even showing up to work. But there you go. But you can see hallucinogens, I'm never going to get that word right, are high. The other ones that are pretty high are stimulants, and so you see abuse of Adderall and those kind of other prescription amphetamines, and then surprising, and pain relievers. That's no surprise. The opioid epidemic out there it continues to be a problem, and so folks are often having an injury or some surgery and having some sort of pain relief medication prescribed, and then they get hooked, and then they can't get the prescriptions refilled. And we've seen all the news around Oxycontin and things like that. And so they can't get those prescriptions filled, and so then they turn to other means to get it without a prescription. And then of course cocaine and crack still are a pretty significant issue for adults, especially young adults. You can see how much more, I mean, it's almost 10 times the number on the crack and cocaine for the 18 to 25 group versus 26-year-olds and plus. So what does all this mean for employers? Well, drug use, especially as it impacts employers, is a significant issue. The SAMHSA published a number a few years ago that says 70% of illicit drug users are employed. About 9% of the working population, according to the SAMHSA, has used illicit drugs in the past year. So obviously this drives up your healthcare and your insurance cost as people go into treatment or have other issues related to their health because of their substance abuse. Obviously it's going to impact productivity, increases the likelihood of workplace accidents, which is, and we'll talk about post-incident testing later, and then just turnover. You either exit that employee or they exit themselves because they can't consistently be reliable and depended upon to come to work. There are obviously criminal penalties for the use of drugs too, and this ties back to some of the fair chance hiring ordinances that are out there. When an employer sees that an employee or a candidate has had criminal history, I always want to, that's related to drugs, I always want to drive back home, just like we would with any other use of criminal history, that it's important to make sure you know what the laws are wherever you're located about the use of criminal history. There are a number of states and municipalities that have implemented fair chance hiring ordinances, and I've got a whole webinar on our website about that. But so I want to make sure that you're aware of that. Many of those local ordinances or state laws require that the employer's consideration of criminal history include the fact that that specific criminal history is directly related to the offense, to the job. And so what that really means is somebody got a marijuana conviction 3 years ago, and in your environment, all they ever do is sit behind a desk. You may have to really ask yourself, is this directly related to the job? And when I'm working with our clients or consulting around how they build their criminal history policies, we always spend a lot of time figuring out what's really directly related to the job, what's really a risk for a specific position. And then how do we make sure that we've documented that maybe it's in our job descriptions, what the job duties are, or the risk associated with the job, or the kind of access that somebody might have because of their they're in that specific role, and what does their past behavior suggest about the risk of putting them in that role now. So again, I've got a whole set of webinars on creating those policies, and you may want to go look at that. But I just want to touch base on that because we do see a lot of drug-related offenses in background checks. Now, if you're a federal contractor, you are going to have the Drug-Free Workplace Act that's going to also govern what you do. And we're going to talk about some of the requirements of that a little later. But as far as criminal history goes, you just need to remember that under the Drug-Free Workplace Act, if you're a federal contractor, you have a responsibility to report to your contracting officer any employees who have a drug-related conviction for an offense that occurred in the workplace. And then those employees also have the responsibility, and it's got to be in your policy, that they're going to tell you about that. So just as far as the legal stuff, criminal history stuff goes, remember that you do, as a federal contractor, you do have that requirement. But apart from federal contractors, what are the legal issues out there? Well, first of all, drug tests are not medical tests under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA does consider substance dependency or addiction an ADA protected medical condition, but it doesn't protect people from testing, from consequences of testing positive for a drug, or certainly being impaired while at work. There are no, as far as drug testing goes, there are no federal limitations for private employers. There's nothing that even says you have to necessarily, just to do a drug test, get the employee's permission. Of course, they're giving permission by showing up at the lab and submitting their sample, or if you're doing an oral swab in your office, they're doing it. It's not, you're not allowed to put them in a headlock and make them do it. So, but there's no specific requirement for that unless you are buying your drug screens from your background checking company or some other third party other than the lab. And then if you are, and I should probably add a slide to this just for this, but the Fair Credit Reporting Act would govern that drug test just like it does everything else you buy from your background check company. And you have to get the same authorizations because it is a consumer report. When you come to Imperative and buy your background checks and you say, I also want to order a drug screen on this person, I don't own a drug screen lab. I send my drug screens to eScreen or Quest or LabCorp, and then they send the response back. That makes it a consumer report because I'm a third party that I didn't interact directly with your candidate and collect that specimen and test it. But if you're dealing directly with LabCorp, Quest, eScreen, one of the big labs to both collect and test your candidate specimens, then and they're giving you the report directly, then it's not a consumer report, and all this information, all that FCRA stuff doesn't apply. However, most of you are probably buying your drug screens through your consumer reporting agency, your background screening partner. Just a reminder, marijuana is still illegal under federal law. And if you're a public employer, and I know we've got a few of them on, you still got Fourth Amendment concerns for those public employees. And we're not going to dig deep into that today, really, but just know that, and you're aware of it, that safety sensitive positions are among the few that you can actually do much testing apart from reasonable suspicion. And then, of course, if you're a motor carrier that's governed by the FMCSA, you're going to have the DOT mandated testing that you have to conduct as well. And we'll touch on that as well. Then state by state, it really varies. It's a mixed bag. And so you're going to have to consult with your drug screening partner or your background check partner to understand what the rules are where you work. And we're based in Texas, and so pew, pew, it's pretty easy here. There are really no limitations on drug testing in Texas. So now some regulated employers do have to have a drug-free workplace policy in place, like we're a licensed private investigations company and we have to have such a policy in place. You can certainly include your drug testing standards, your prohibitions related to testing positive for any controlled substances, things like that, as a condition of hire and or as a condition, continued employment. I think it ought to be good in your policy and in your handbook. But there's no specific consent reform required in Texas. Like I mentioned, there's none under federal law. Some states do require you to get some sort of authorization, but in reality, if you're using any of the big collection sites and labs, LabCorp, Quest, any of those guys, when your candidate or your employee walks into the collection facility, they're going to fill out paper and sign and authorize the drug screen anyway, just using their standard paperwork from the big labs. So what are the key components of a drug-free workplace policy? Well, first of all, you want to do an assessment, right? Figure out where we are. What challenges does our organization face right now in this area? And then we're going to certainly have a written policy. We're going to do employee education, supervisor training. The things that are in red, the written policy, employee education, and supervisor training are all required under the Drug-Free Workplace Act for federal contractors. But even if you're a federal contractor, you want to do more than just those three things. You want to start by assessing what's going on. Then we want to create our policy, do our employee education, do whatever supervisor training to recognize what our policy is around things like post-incident testing or reasonable suspicion testing. Then you also want to consider, do we have an EAP? Have we marketed it to our employees well? Or likewise, should we consider it an EAP? And then what is our drug testing policy going to be? Those are all the key components of what you should really consider. And we're going to dive into those. The first thing you're going to do, of course, if you're an organization that doesn't have a policy in place, you're going to want to build a team. This isn't something that HR should just do by itself, or risk management or safety. You really want to get buy-in from across the organization. I'm a big believer that in any of these big risk mitigation kind of policies, you always want somebody from senior leadership in the room for those conversations. I am traveling next week to consult with a client around their use of criminal history, and we're going to build their policies and their risk assessments. And I really hope, always encourage, that somebody from a senior level leader be in that room for a couple of reasons. First of all, they've got a certain higher level of fiduciary responsibility for the organization, so they're going to be paying attention to the risk to the organization. But also, if your policy is ever challenged, or if, let's say, worst case scenario, you put your policy in place and some employee is involved in an accident or something and subsequently tests positive for some controlled substance, it's going to help, in my opinion, it's not going to hurt, and certainly it may help mitigate any liability when you say, hey, we had this policy, we had this process, and it was so important that we even included senior leadership in helping craft the policy. They didn't just approve it, they were involved in the conversations around how we use drug testing and what we accept and what we don't and what our policies are. This wasn't something that we just bought in an often online website and stuck in our handbook. This was something that we really thought about in the context of our organization. You also want those management supervisors who are dealing with employees on a regular basis as part of that team. HR, if you have an occupational health group, then on-site medical of any kind, you probably want to include them, especially if they're going to be involved or may be involved in doing collections. When I was in aerospace, all of our drug testing collections were on site with our occupational health team, and so we had to go. And we did that in both when I was in aerospace and in healthcare. That's where we did our drug testing. If you've got a risk management, a security team, people like that, you want to include them. And your risk management folks, if they're who also manages your liability and your GL and all those things, you may want to talk to make sure that they're involved so that they can talk to your carriers. Your carriers may have specific concerns or specific processes they want you to go through with regard to your drug screening process and your drug-free workplace. And then, of course, if you're in an organized environment, and judging by the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of us are going to be in an organized environment that never thought we would be. You want to have your union reps in there, and they need to be involved in that, and you may be part of your labor negotiations as well. And who do you want on that team? Well, those are the roles, but you want to make sure you've got people who have taken the time or can be educated about the legal and safety risks around this. anyone who's got an awareness of what's going on in our organization right now and may know that we've had these specific issues that we haven't maybe published out to the whole organization and certainly to the whole world, but we know we've got those issues. Somebody who's really aware of what's gone on in the organization and especially in the recent past, we want to make sure that they're on the team. Somebody who's got the trust of other employees, because whenever you roll out something like this, you're always going to have employee pushback, and if it's seen as coming from someone who or from management, and there's not a lot of trust with management, that's going to impact the effectiveness of the program, but also it's going to impact just the level of employee engagement. If they think this is just something that management's doing to try to get rid of certain employees or things like that, you really need to have somebody who's seen and trusted from the employee side of the equation. Somebody who can, definitely need somebody who can help you communicate your policy and write your policy and do the marketing internally of what your new program is going to be. And they all need to believe in a drug-free workplace. One thing you don't, it's one thing to have, ethical and practical conversations around the use of marijuana in our society. But everybody needs to at least agree that employees shouldn't be under the influence of marijuana while they're at the office or at work or in the workplace. And so those are all key components of what you should do as you're building your team. And then what is the team's job? Well, first of all, like I said, we need to do the assessment. We need to identify any existing issues. We need with substance abuse. And this goes for alcohol too. I'm not talking about alcohol quite so much today, but certainly alcohol is a big problem in many workplaces, and probably a larger problem than actually being impaired at work, and because they're under the influence of some other substance. You need to know identify what your current legal requirements are related to all of this. Are you a federal contractor? Are there state regulations that control you if you've got a state license or something like that? Or is there something there? Are there state laws in place that limit or control or regulate how an employer approaches a drug-free workplace, or especially drug testing? All of those issues, we need to get all those lined out. And that can be a pretty big task. And then, of course, once we figure that out, we can craft our drug-free workplace policy and what our procedures for testing are and what we're going to do when somebody does test positive and those kinds of things. And then the same team needs to put together how we're going to market and educate this information to our employees in a way that shows hopefully some compassion and communicates that this is about safety, and it's not just physical safety. It may be physical safety, but also data security, asset protection, in addition to workplace safety issues. And how are we going to communicate that initially, and how are we going to do it on an ongoing basis? How do we continue to remind people these are our policies? And when we bring in new employees, what does the orientation look like? They've got to do all of that. And then on an ongoing basis, evaluate how our plan's working. Too often these things get put into place, and we see that maybe we have issues here or there, but we really don't address them, or we're not measuring things like how many workplace incidents did we have where we did post-accident testing and people were tested positive for some controlled substance, or how many people went through our EAP program when we made that offering, those kinds of things. We need to know that that the program is effective and that we're communicating to our employees in a way that encourages them to utilize whatever resources we've made available. So when we're assessing the workplace, first thing we want to look at is what safety sensitive or security sensitive positions are in place. I mean, you may have contracts with the department or be regulated by the Department of Transportation, contracts with the Department of Defense, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They all have their own unique approach to and expectations of contractors or regulated entities. Fortunately, many of them overlap and look very similar to what the Department of Transportation is doing in that area, whether it's for motor carriers or pilots and aircraft mechanics, things like that. But we need to figure out who in our organization we may have some regulatory responsibilities for, but also just looking at what positions, they may not be regulated positions, but what positions are really specifically safety or security sensitive. And let's identify those and figure out, have we had issues in those areas? These are the areas where if somebody's really impaired, it's going to cause a real issue for the organization and put us at risk. And so there may be positions that you say, yeah, we're going to do random drug testing because these are really safety sensitive or security sensitive positions. We're going to do random drug testing. But for our admin clerical staff that doesn't have access to really proprietary data or PII or things like that, we're not going to do random drug testing. That's fine. You can set up a drug testing program based on risk according to different groups of employees. The issue there is always going to be, what are those employees who are being tested are going to think about that process when there aren't other people who are getting tested. There are other people who are not getting tested. And again, the OFCCP's, if you're an OFCCP contractor, the Drug-Free Workplace Act requires that your policy include, the prohibition of those substances in the workplace, the consequences of testing positive or being under the influence, and some sort of awareness program that you communicate on an ongoing basis to employees to make sure that they understand what their obligations are and what the company's position is with regard to the use of drugs. So that's just the beginning of just figuring out what we're going to do. But let's see, then we want to look back at our history. What has happened in the past? What have we had issues? I've got a friend who took over the SHRO role at a large employer here in North Texas, maybe 400 employees at the time. And this is the first issue he had to tackle. He had basically a call center kind of environment, and he had employees selling drugs on the floor of the call center, and smoking marijuana in the fire stairwells, things like that. So, what issues have you had in your organization in the past? Because that's going to drive some of what we address and how we approach things. So have you had drug-related issues that you're aware of in the past? And then maybe you need some employee feedback. Maybe you need to do a survey and reach out to your employees and invite, have open meetings about, hey, we're creating this drug-free workplace. These are the reasons for it. And we want your feedback. You may hear from employees, yeah, you've got an issue here, you've got an issue here. Make a way for employees to give you feedback in a way that's safe for them, and they don't have to fear any retribution or retaliation. Get your leadership and your managers to bring these issues up in staff meetings regularly, and constantly have a feedback system so that your employees know this is serious and that there is a way for them to provide information. Maybe you've got an employee hotline, maybe you've got a suggestion box, whatever you've got in your organization, give them a way to do that. And remember, whatever they tell you could be an ongoing active issue right now, and you may have to turn around and conduct an investigation. So be prepared for that. Have an idea of, okay, if we find out that, we've got people allegedly using drugs or even alcohol on the work site, or coming to work under the influence, what are we going to do about it? How do we investigate it? Have that plan in place as well. And who's going to conduct that investigation? And then we've done our assessment, so we need to start building our policy. And I think the first thing on any of these policies, the first thing you want to do is state the reason for the policy. We want to ensure a safe work environment for our employees, our customers, and the public. We want to protect the company's assets. We want to maintain employee productivity. Just the reality is, eagles don't fly with turkeys, and if you've got employees who aren't performing at a certain level because they're impaired at work, whether it's a safety issue or not, that's going to impact the organization, and the people that you want to leave, you want to maintain and keep and incentivize, aren't going to be as incentivized if they have to work with folks who are not carrying their weight. And then we want to protect the organization's reputation. What would happen if we had a drug-related injury or accident, or heaven forbid, a death of some sort because of some sort of negligence or impairment? What would that do to the organization's reputation? And those are all valid reasons, and you can state those right up in the front of your policy. This is why we care about this stuff, where this isn't about Big Brother, the employer looking over everybody's shoulders and trying to micromanage our employees' lives. Most employers I talk to wish they didn't have to do drug testing. Most employers I talk to wish they didn't have to do background checks. It's a necessary evil, unfortunately. But the reality is, we need that. We need to know, what's going on in an organization to make sure that we're being good stewards of the organization as leaders. What does your policy cover? And that's going to be the next thing you want to cover in the policy. Is it on-site only? We're only going to be concerned about on-duty conduct. Or are we also going to be concerned about off-duty conduct? Some states protect off-duty conduct, but as far as I'm aware, none of them protect illegal off-duty conduct. And so if we're talking about illicit drugs, at least, then you're generally going to be in good shape. But again, you're going to want to look at the laws in your specific jurisdictions. And that could even, be in the human rights ordinance in your own city or county. So you really want to dig into that stuff. There's a Texas court that sided with a school teacher. We're here in Texas, marijuana is illegal, and she tested positive for marijuana. She said, well, I was in Colorado and it's legal in Colorado. And the school district said, doesn't matter. Our policy says that you cannot test positive for marijuana, and they terminated her. Which on its face seems very reasonable. I think that's what many companies' policies would say. However, the court said, well, actually, no. She didn't violate any state laws, any Texas laws, when she was in Colorado and ingested gummies or smoked weed or whatever. So she didn't violate Texas law when she did that. She's a public employee, and she didn't, and the judge actually said, gambling is illegal in Texas, but it's legal in Nevada. You don't fire employees for gambling when they go to Nevada, when they go to Vegas. And that was the judge's analogy. So that's not necessarily a precedent-setting case, but know that as you look at off-duty conduct, you're going to have to pay attention to issues around, what's the real impact of this off-duty conduct in the workplace. And as when we get to marijuana, especially, we're going to talk about some of those kind of issues. One thing that employers sometimes make a mistake on is say that it's against company policy to be impaired while at work impaired by the use of some controlled substance while at work. The problem is, with the exception of alcohol, drug tests don't tell you, they don't measure impairment. They just measure and detect use. And so if impairment may not, if most policies say that it's illegal to test positive or for that substance and to have those metabolites in your system while you're at work. And that's because there's no direct correlation. There's not a test to say this person is 30% impaired or 60% impaired or not impaired at all by their use of some substance. And so just strictly saying impairment is probably not accurate and thorough enough for you to use a positive drug test as a reason to terminate somebody. Impairment by itself isn't strong enough. And we want to make sure that our policy statement is really clear, that there's no ambiguity. Anytime you've got a policy that really may result, especially in somebody's immediate termination or significantly change the terms and conditions of their employment, you want to make sure it's what you've got is very clear. Give me a second. It's allergy season in North Texas, and my allergy meds are kicking in here. The Texas Workforce Commission has a drug-free workplace policy that's very simple and would certainly work in Texas, maybe not other places. Also, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration has a drug-free workplace toolkit that includes policy considerations. And everybody, whether you're watching this live or you're watching the recording, you'll have the ability to receive all the notes, because most of my slides are just pictures. You'll have opportunity to receive all the notes that include links to both the Texas Workforce Commission information and the SAMHSA drug-free workplace information. So the first thing we want to say is that the company expressly prohibits having drugs on your person or using them while on the company or on customer premises or while performing some assignment on behalf of the company. That's obvious, right? We don't want people coming to work with controlled substances on their person, in their vehicle, and we certainly don't want them using it or buying drugs while they're at work. Then you also want to say that, and this is all language straight out of the Workforce Commission's sample policy, the Texas Workforce Commission sample policy. We don't want you impaired or under the influence of legal or illegal drugs or alcohol. So, that's pretty obvious too, right? It's, we don't want you showing up stoned. We don't want you showing up inebriated or anything like that. And we don't want you showing up, hyped up on Adderall. It may make you a more productive employee for a while, but it's eventually going to cause problems. And our policy is that you're not here, where you, if you're impaired to the point where it affects your ability to safely perform your duties. And so we don't care if it is legal or illegal. We don't want you at work under the influence in a way that that affects your performance. And then certainly any off-duty conduct that, regardless it's on company premises or away from company premises, if that conduct is going to affect your ability to do your job, the safety of the employee or other people, or puts the company's reputation at risk. And again, that's pretty straightforward. Just like off-duty, I don't want somebody robbing a convenience store either, right? Because or committing some other offense, because that could have blowback on the organization our reputation in the community, even if it doesn't happen while the person's at work. And then this is the one that really boils down to what we get, what most of us think about and what really happens most of the time regarding drug abuse in the workplace is our policy prohibits the presence of any detectable amount of any prohibited substances in the workplace while at work, on the premises of the company or the customers, or while on company business. So in other words, you can't have the metabolites, you can't have breath alcohol level over the cutoff limits. And you can't even be under the influence of a prescribed medication if it creates a safety sensitive or safety concern. So if you're driving forklifts and you're on some medicine that impairs your ability to operate that heavy equipment or a motor vehicle or anything like that, then you're in violation of the company policy, even if it's got a prescription. We're going to want to deal with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the interactive process and all of that. But it's your job as the employee to come to us with those issues before you get behind the wheel of that forklift or operate that heavy equipment or whatever it is. And then your policy needs to explain what prohibited substances are, right? Illegal drugs, alcohol, prescription drugs that aren't taken in accordance with the prescription given by the physician. So pretty straightforward there, but we need to make sure that it's really clear so that an employee can't come back later and say, well, I didn't violate policy. Your policy didn't cover this thing. So what employees are going to be covered? We need to decide that. It's possible that, like I said earlier, your safety sensitive employees are going to have a different drug testing characterization and process than your non-safety sensitive employees. Maybe what you do in your office is going to be different than what you do in the warehouse or for your drivers. What if we roll our process out, our drug-free workplace program, and somebody self-reports and said, hey, now that we're talking about it, I need to tell you I've got this issue. Okay, so let's be prepared for that. And our policy should already tell us how we're going to do this. What do we do when an employee self-identifies? Do we refer them to the EAP? Do we refer them to, if we don't have an EAP and our insurance doesn't cover it, where do they go for that? Do we refer them to a local nonprofit or some other substance abuse treatment? What's our communication to that employee? We have to tell them we're not, we understand that you've got this issue and we're going to treat it as an issue under the ADA. And we're going to go through the interactive process and you're going to have to go get an evaluation from a physician and all that. But at the same time, you can't be positive for those substances while you're at work. And that's still going to be our policy. And we're not going to make an accommodation of you testing positive at some point. But you probably don't want to just immediately drug test someone when they tell you, hey, I've got an issue. That's going to be really bad for employee morale, and it's going to make it less likely that other employees with issues and who need help are going to come to you. That's one of the reasons that EAPs are a great idea, right? So that this employee doesn't have to go to a manager or somebody like that or HR. They can just call the EAP and enter into the EAP program and get assistance. But if they do self-identify and say, hey, I've got an issue, maybe that's part of your policy. We do a mandatory referral to EAP and they have to complete some program, especially if they test positive for some reason, and then they tell you they got an issue. Maybe your policy says that we require you to complete this program through our EAP or through some other approved provider. Your policy should talk about what kinds of drug testing you're going to do. Pre-employment is probably the most common. And, before you come in the door, you got to be clean. And it's always amazing to me. I think pre-employment drug testing is basically an intelligence test. We don't get into it in this webinar as much, but almost everything, unless you're a really, really, really heavy user, you've got some unique biological issues, almost everything metabolizes out of your system within 7 days. And so if that person, they know they're going through the process, they're interviewing, they're doing all these things, and they fail a drug test, that's more of an intelligence failure than anything else. And then, of course, you've got random testing or periodic testing. Some employers do true random testing where it's truly random, and you could get, every month we're going to choose 4%, or annually we're going to make sure we get 10% of our employees tested. We're going to draw 10% out for testing. You may get somebody who gets tested 3 times in that year, which is good, because what you don't want to do is have random testing where you say, okay, we pulled Mike in January, so we're going to take him out of the pool, so he doesn't have to get tested. He won't be included in the testing pool to get randomly drawn until next year. Well, that tells me I've got a year to do whatever I want to. And so you don't want to do that. So you always want your random or testing to make sure, to be sure that you that it includes everybody and not just people who haven't been tested recently. Definitely post-accident, for cause testing, return to duty testing. If somebody has, or not, so return to duty, I'm sorry, post-accident testing, where somebody has, there's an injury or something like that, a certain amount of damage. I've got a client that has a fleet of vehicles, and anytime there's vehicle damage exceeding $50 or something like that, they immediately send that person for drug testing and breath alcohol testing. Then there's return to duty after somebody's been out, maybe for medical leave or substance abuse professional, treatment, any of those kinds of things. When they return to duty, we want to test them. And then the same for often a lot of employers, if somebody's just on an extended leave, not just vacation, but they're on some sort of leave for 3 months, 6 months out, and they come back, we're going to treat them like a new employee and have them do the same kind of testing on return to work. What's in a drug test? I'm going to give you the slides, but these are, you typically hear 9 or 10 panel, and it says 9 panel, but there's 10 things on that one. But that's your typical 10 panel test, and your 7 panel, which is the DOT test. We're running late on time, but I want to make sure we cover marijuana. Do you really care about marijuana? Right now, 39 states have legalized some kind of marijuana use in medical or other or recreational, and 19 have legalized recreational use. Increasingly, I'm talking to employers who, either because it's just getting so hard to hire people, especially right now, who aren't testing positive for marijuana. And so more and more employers are taking marijuana off their pre-employment screen. They're treating it basically like alcohol. If you show up impaired at work and we test you because of reasonable suspicion, you're slurring your words like I am right now, and I'm not even doing anything. You're slurring your words, or you have an accident or something like that, and we're going to send you for testing. We're going to include marijuana in that. We want to know if there's a chance you're impaired. And it's still going to be against our policy to have the metabolites to be to test positive, basically, for marijuana. But we're going to communicate that heavily to new employees as they come into the organization. But we're not necessarily going to exclude them and upfront on based on their use of marijuana pre-employment. However, what I would recommend you do then is that you remove the marijuana from that drug screen altogether, not just ignore a positive drug screen. Because now once you've got a positive drug screen, you got a piece of paper that says they tested positive for this, and you're going to put it in a file. And then when something goes wrong down the line, you may have to explain why you ignored it. Whereas it's probably more reasonable to talk to your lawyers. I'm not your attorney. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. But it may be more reasonable to say pre-employment, we only test for these substances, and then in our random process, and then we educate our employees about why we care about marijuana, just like we do everything else. And post-injury, post-accident, or reasonable suspicion, we do include marijuana in there, and we've done everything we can to educate employees. And increasingly, I am talking to employers who that's their approach. They're treating marijuana like alcohol. They don't really care what the employee did last week or over the weekend. But if you show up impaired, and even if you're not impaired by marijuana, because there's not really a measurement for that, But if you show up impaired in some way and you test positive for marijuana, then that's going to have consequences. There we go. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, it's the federal government entity that's responsible for a variety of things related to drug and alcohol testing programs and mental health issues. Their process doesn't necessarily apply to non-regulated, federally regulated employers, but it's really the best practice. It includes going through, a chain of custody process where we track where that specimen's gone, and we know we're really connecting this specimen to this candidate, and that can be paper or electronic. Both versions are available, and it's extremely rare now to see paper chain of custody. It's almost all electronic. And then they do an initial screen on the sample, and if it tests potentially positive, it goes to the lab. Often at that point in the lab, we'll do a confirmation test to make sure that the cutoff levels are right, and just science the heck out of it to make sure that it's really the right, these are the right substances, and this is what we're measuring for. Often they do a split sample so that they set aside part of the sample they collected in case they have to do a retest later. And then before the employer is ever aware that there's an issue, it goes to the medical review officer. An MRO will review that information, and they'll contact the applicant and say, hey, you tested positive for XYZ. A substance, do you have a prescription for it? And often, most of the time, they're not going to have a prescription for it because, but it could be opioids or something that is a prescribable medicine. That's where we can usually see that we're going to have an issue with a candidate when we're doing the drug screening. The MRO will tell us, hey, I've tried to contact this guy 2 or 3 times over the last several days, and they're not returning our calls. And so we're going to return this drug screen as positive. And that the candidate was unresponsive to our inquiries. And if you're working with a good MRO, I've worked with some great ones who are really kind and compassionate, even with somebody who tests positive for something that they can't get a prescription for. That's always better, because it's in that environment is just, you don't want, even if you have to terminate somebody because of of testing positive for the substance, if they're treated respectfully throughout the process, you're better off as an organization, and people will feel respected. And if they leave, even if they're terminated with dignity, it's always better. Then your policy needs to say, what are we going to do? If somebody tests positive, is it going to be zero tolerance? And our policy is, you test positive, you're terminated. Many employers have that kind of policy. Others make a referral to EAP with continued testing. If you complete a substance abuse program, we will, test you maybe with higher frequency after you've returned for some period of time. But don't treat each situation just as it occurs. Have a policy in place that says, here's how we do it, so that managers don't have to make those decisions right then, and it's consistent. Because one thing you don't want in anything that's going to lead to, somebody's ultimate termination is inconsistency. And document everything. That's probably obvious. And then make sure your awareness and education program, as I said earlier, is ongoing. Stay in front of employees. Stay in your new employee orientation, talk about this stuff in your employee handbook, in your general communications to all employees, your newsletters, your company blogs, all those things. Make sure that your managers are talking about the drug-free workplace policies in your regular staff meetings. If employees feel like you're taking it seriously, and that if they've got a problem, there's a place to go, they're going to be more likely to participate and buy into your drug-free workplace program. And it'll give you the environment to create the opportunity to create a safe work environment, but people also feel respected, and if they've got a problem, they can get some help. That's I can tell you from personal experience, helping an employee through those difficult times creates a very engaged employee who will stick by you a lot longer than the employee who feels like they weren't treated compassionately or with respect. And that is our time. I want to always promote the podcast, Good Morning HR, where I talk to business leaders about creating value for shareholders, customers, and the community. We drop a new episode of Good Morning HR every Thursday morning. We dropped one today. And each episode is pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM recertification credits. Some of them are even approved for HRCI business credit, and you can also get your several of them are good for ethics credit, at least half an hour some of credit, and so you get half an hour of credit for recertification just by listening to me ask dumb questions of smart people. And so goodmorninghr.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. It's also on YouTube and even in our Facebook page for Good Morning HR. So it's all out there, and you can get credit just by listening. And if you're watching the recording, you'll need recertification credit. And the keyword that you're going to have to enter on the form below the video is stoned. That's the keyword for the drug-free workplace webinar if you're watching recorded. If you're watching us live, thank you, and watch for an email tomorrow, probably tomorrow afternoon, with the recertification credit information and a link to download the slides and notes. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to stick around and answer them. You can also email me. My email is right there. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'm glad if I can help to try and help. That was a lot of information in an hour, but I hope it was helpful. And thank you for joining me. I'm Mike Coffey, and I just, if I can be of help to you personally or professionally, please don't hesitate to reach out. Until then, be well, do good, keep your chin up. Thank you.